In 1940, long before the United States entered World War II, a band of American airmen went into action against Japan. The aircraft they flew bore distinctive shark's teeth on the nose, a symbol which the Japanese came to fear. Their official name was the American Volunteer Group, or AVG. But to the world, they became known as the Flying Tigers. In their brief life, the Tigers established a combat record which bears comparison with any of the elite fighter units of the Second World War. The Tigers were a small outfit, but their superb training and the rugged fighter they flew secured them air superiority against almost overwhelming odds. Their commander was a taciturn, weather-beaten American airman, Claire Chennault. Chennault had been at war with the Japanese since 1937, when he'd been appointed air advisor to the Chinese government. His story had begun 20 years earlier, in April 1917, when the United States entered World War I and American troops sailed off to a western front in France, which had long since congealed into a bloody stalemate. The firepower of machine guns and artillery had produced a mud-bound deadlock in which the opposing armies glowered at each other from their trench systems. Desperate efforts were being made to break this stranglehold. By 1917, many of the guns massed on the Western Front were firing at a new kind of target. Military aircraft were now playing an important part in the war. In 1914, the combatants had gone to war with only a handful of unarmed reconnaissance aircraft between them. By the time American troops arrived in France, however, the air fleets of Britain, France, and Germany were numbered in their thousands. Aircraft were designed to perform specific roles. Reconnaissance remained a vital function, but now there were also fighters, bombers, and ground attack warplanes. Dogfights took place high above the trenches, and in these aerial maelstroms, the rudiments of air tactics evolved. With no combat aircraft of their own, the infant American Air Corps was obliged to equip itself with types supplied by its allies. The Americans proved quick learners, and it was not long before they boasted their own fighter aces. Although the aeroplane did not exert a decisive influence on the course of the war had a decisive influence on the aeroplane. Its design, engine power, weapons carrying capabilities, and ability to bring them to bear. The relentless dynamic of war had not only accelerated the efforts of aircraft designers and engineers, but had also established patterns for the use of air power which are still recognizable today. Claire Chennault had learned to fly while serving in the US Signal Corps in 1917-18, but he'd not made it to France and had to wait until 1919 before he became an air service cadet. In 1922, Chennault was posted to the US Army Air Corps 1st Pursuit Group. In his own words, he had tasted the air and could not get it out of my craw. In spite of the breaking up of the large air forces with which the Allies had ended the war, the new world of aviation exerted a strong hold on the public imagination. Surplus warplanes and unemployed aircrew entered the world of barnstorming aerial shows. Chennault, now an Air Corps flying instructor, formed his own celebrated aerobatic team, the Flying Trapeze. Chennault and his team thrilled crowds across America, but there was a serious side to the stunts they devised and flew. For Chennault, they were part of a battle for the soul of the United States Army Air Corps. In the immediate post-war years, one of the most influential figures in American military aviation was General Billy Mitchell, who had commanded U.S. Air Forces on the Western Front. Mitchell was an early and vigorous prophet of air power. In a spectacular series of exercises in 1921, his bombers plastered obsolete battleships with phosphorus and heavy bombs. Mitchell believed that the key to future wars was air bombardment. He was an enthusiastic supporter of the Barling bomber, a triplane with a wingspan of 120 feet. But it was all the Barling's 4 Liberty engines could do to get it into the air, let alone power the monster through it. The Barling project was abandoned in 1925, after the expenditure of over $300,000. Like Mitchell, Chennault believed in air power, but he was first and last a fighter man and the author of an incisive tract on air tactics. But as the 20s gave way to the 30s, the trim biplane fighters of the world's air forces were threatened by the advent of new, fast, all-metal monoplane bombers. What use were these interceptors if they could no longer intercept the fleets of bombers which were to cast a long, dark shadow over the new decade? In the Soviet Union, the Red Air Force experimented with bombers whose size eclipsed the unwieldy Barling. Would the bomber always get through? Joseph Stalin seemed to think so. His new bombers were also adapted to carry and drop airborne troops. Sweeping changes in military aviation were underway, not only in the Soviet Union, but also in Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler's rearmament program, at first conducted in secret and then announced to the world in March 1935, also placed great emphasis on air power. One of its products was the Heinkel HE-111 bomber, twin-engined with exceptionally clean aerodynamic lines. Early versions of the Heinkel had seen service in the Spanish Civil War, supporting General Franco. Their impact seemed to confirm the highest hopes of bombing theorists. Trotting in the footsteps of Stalin and Hitler was the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. He had used his bombers during the Italian invasion and conquest of Abyssinia. They dropped not only conventional high explosive, but also bombs armed with poison gas. On the other side of the Atlantic, the US Army Air Corps had also joined the bomber race. Its Martin bomber of the mid-30s was a truly revolutionary aircraft. The all-metal monoplane boasted a fully enclosed bomb load and positions for its 5-man crew, plus retractable undercarriage, flaps, and variable pitch airscrew. This was the way of the future. And the future seemed to lie with bombers like the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the first version of which entered service with the Army Air Corps in 1937. Fast, heavily armed, and capable of striking at long range, these sleek bombers embodied the vision of air power. By now, however, there had also been a fighter revolution. early example was Britain's first monoplane fighter, the Hawker Hurricane, introduced by the Royal Air Force in the winter of 1937. With a top speed of over 300 miles per hour, the rugged, fabric-covered Hurricane was a match for any contemporary bomber. In 1938, the Hurricane was followed into service by the Supermarine Spitfire. By 1939, the RAF had been transformed from a force of obsolescent biplanes to a modern fighter arm. The transformation had come not a moment too soon. For the Spitfire and Hurricane was soon to be locked in combat with the German Me-109, the earliest monoplane fighter of the three. Like the He-111, it had seen combat in the Spanish Civil War. In the year that the Hurricane entered service, Claire Chennault left the US Army Air Corps. He'd been on the losing side in the inter-service bomber versus fighter battle. But Chennault was not unemployed for long. The day after his retirement, he left for China to train fighter pilots at a school sponsored by the wife of the Chinese leader, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. The attractive, American-educated Madame Chiang was a formidable figure, whom Chennault dubbed the Princess. Her husband was the leader of the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. By the time Chennault arrived in China, Chiang Kai-shek had cemented an uneasy alliance with the Chinese Communists, led by Mao Zedong, with whom the nationalists had been fighting a bitter civil war. The internal battle for the control of China had been inconclusive. In 1934, Chiang had encircled the Communists in their stronghold in Kiangsi. But the Communists broke out and in an epic march reached the safety of Yan'an. The Civil War had diverted Chiang's attention from an even more dangerous enemy of China, Japan. At the end of 1931, the Japanese had seized control of the northern Chinese province of Manchuria. They renamed it Manchu Kuo, consolidated their grip, and installed as a puppet the last emperor of China, Puyi. The annexation of Manchuria was the first step in the drive by the Japanese to secure the mineral wealth they lacked. When the League of Nations demanded that the Japanese withdraw from Manchuria, the response of their ambassador was swift.
It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world.
After these hollow words, the Japanese left the League of Nations. Nor were they content with bringing peace to Manchuria. In January 1932, they shelled and bombed the city of Shanghai after a mob had murdered 2 Japanese. By 1935, the Japanese had conquered an area which stretched from the Great Wall of China to within 15 miles of Peking. By the winter of 1941, they had seized most of China's coastline and large tracts of the interior. Chiang Kai-shek's government was forced to flee to Chongqing, some 1,000 miles inland from Shanghai. By 1940, China's only landward link with the West was the Burma Road, the mountainous overland route running from Lashio in Burma to Kunming in China. It was along the dizzying contours of the Burma Road, 700 twisting mountain miles rising to 9,000 feet, that war materials continued to reach the hard-pressed Chinese armies. But the Burma Road was a lifeline which would soon come under threat. From the beginning of the war with Japan, the Chinese had been ill-equipped to resist the modern aircraft and well-trained crews of the Japanese Air Force. They had paved the way for the troops on the ground. The Chinese Air Force could mount only token resistance. In its ranks, there was not a single Chinese officer with the technical ability to plan and organize a combat mission of any size. Chennault had been pitched into the war on his arrival in China. He later recalled, "Without a moment's preparation, I found myself planning my first combat mission. After 20 years of practicing for war, I was finally playing for keeps." Chennault's influence was quickly felt. New airfields were built in outlying areas to enable irreplaceable aircraft to be dispersed. The methods were primitive, but effective. Simultaneously, a radio warning net was established to allow time for Chinese fighters to intercept Japanese bombing raids on previously undefended cities. The Japanese had had their own way over China, flying unescorted bombing missions. Their aircraft had bombed and strafed at will. When they mounted a heavy raid on Chongqing, Chennault refused to take cover, standing in the open and calmly taking notes like a football coach, studying the methods of a rival team. Chennault introduced his Chinese fighter pilots to the combat element of pairs. If they became separated in action, they were to join the nearest friendly two-man element as a tail cover. Japanese losses soon began to mount. This swiftly brought an end to their unescorted bombing operations. Chennault himself began to fly lone combat missions in a Curtiss Hawk, a gift from Madame Chiang Kai-shek. He's said to have shot down 40 Japanese aircraft on these solo patrols. The standard Japanese fighter, the Mitsubishi Type 96, lacked the range for a bomber escort. But in 1939, the answer was provided by the Mitsubishi A6M0. This machine was destined to be Japan's frontline fighter from 1940 to 1943. Armed with two 20mm cannon and two machine guns, and with a top speed in excess of 300 miles per hour, the Zero could cope with all opposition, and its agility and rate of climb ensured its safety in combat. Chennault was to get to know the Zero very well in the coming years. In the meantime, Chennault had staved off defeat in the air with a contingent of Soviet pilots who arrived in the wake of a non-aggression pact signed between China and the Soviet Union. But by the end of 1940, the Russian pilots and their stubby Polikarpov fighters had been withdrawn. Chennault knew that the survival of the Chinese Air Force, and perhaps China itself, ultimately depended on American intervention in the form of aircraft and pilots. This would not have been the first time that American pilots had fought as mercenaries in a foreign war. Before the United States had entered the First World War, a number of American airmen had fought for the French Air Force in the famous Escadrille Lafayette. The Escadrille Lafayette had scored 43 victories in the skies over the Western Front. The squadron's pilots cut glamorous figures. They had a lion cub as their mascot. And the squadron produced one of the great aces of the war, Raoul Lufbery, who was shot down and killed in May 1918. But as Chennault pondered the task of recruitment which lay ahead, dramatic events were unfolding in Europe. On the 14th of June 1940, the victorious German army had entered Paris. The French surrendered to Germany a week later. Adolf Hitler paid his first and last visit to Paris as a conqueror. Before the German army could launch a cross-channel invasion of southern Britain, the Luftwaffe had to defeat the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain had begun. Like the Chinese, the British were fighting for their survival. But they had just enough Spitfires, Hurricanes and pilots, a handful of whom were American volunteers, to establish a narrow but decisive margin over the Luftwaffe. The German invasion never came. Instead, as autumn drew in, London and Britain's other great ports and industrial cities were battered by German bombers in an offensive which lasted until the spring of 1941. The Blitz was aimed at cracking British morale. But the British held firm. Contrary to the orthodoxies of the 1930s, the bomber had got through, but had failed. The United States was still at peace, and there were plenty of its people who wanted America to stay that way. But President Franklin Roosevelt had made it clear where his sympathies lay.
On this 10th day of June, 1940, in this university, founded by the first great American teacher of democracy, we send forth our prayers and our hopes to those beyond the seas who are maintaining with magnificent valor their battle for freedom.
Chennault traveled to America in the autumn of 1940. By now, events in Europe had overshadowed the struggle for China. The Sino-Japanese War was seen as a sideshow. Yellow man killing yellow man, as Time magazine put it. It was difficult to raise concern for Chongqing when London was being bombed every night. Nevertheless, by February 1941, persistent lobbying of the US government and military had secured agreement to the formation of an American Foreign Legion, whose personnel would be employed by a private company, the Central American Manufacturing Company. The final decision had to go right to the man at the top. It had taken the personal but secret involvement of President Roosevelt to enable Chennault to begin recruiting men from the US Air Services for the American Volunteer Group in China. Another band of American pilots and ground crew fighting under a foreign flag was about to take shape. The recruitment terms on offer were generous. $600 for a wingman, $750 for a squadron commander, and a $500 bonus for every Japanese plane shot down. Eventually, 190 ground personnel and 109 Army, Navy and Marine Corps pilots were persuaded to resign from the services and sign a contract with Camco. The first AVG contingent to sail for the Far East in July 1941 consisted of 40 ground personnel and Chaplain Paul Frillman. The aircraft that they would tend was the Curtiss-Wright P-40B Tomahawk, a batch originally earmarked for the RAF. During the war, some 14,000 P-40s served in virtually all the Allied air forces and on all fronts, including the Western Desert, where the British had adopted a distinctive shark's teeth marking on the fighter's long nose. The Tomahawk was immensely rugged and dependable, and was fitted with self-sealing fuel tanks, one of the lessons learned in the Battle of Britain. The fighter packed a punch, with 4 wing-mounted .303 machine guns and a pair of synchronized .5-inch guns firing through the propeller. With its great weight of armor and guns, the Tomahawk could outdive the Zero, but it struggled in a dogfight with its nimble Japanese adversary. The AVG's first base was not in China, but the British colony of Burma. Tunggu was a hard-surfaced airfield in the jungle north of Rangoon. It had been leased to China by the RAF on the condition that it was used for training purposes only. Chennault buckled down to the business of training a disparate group of pilots, some of whom had never flown a fighter, into an effective combat formation. he drilled them in the assets of the Tomahawk, its diving speed and firepower, and taught them to avoid dogfights with the more maneuverable Zero. One of Chennault's pilots recalled, "He told us, never stay in and fight, never try to turn, never try to mix with them, get altitude and dive on them and keep going. Hit and run tactics." One of Chennault's best pilots was David Lee Tex Hill.
One P-40 against one Japanese aircraft, fighter aircraft, no way you'd shoot him down. The minute you close on him, why, he'd immediately pull it into a steep turn, and you couldn't pull enough deflection on him to get him.
Yes.
And he'd be right on your tail,
You
so
just
we'd
couldn't
roll it
turn,
over
right?
and dive out. But with the two-ship element, and you could single one Japanese out, you could catch him, and he would fly along and be watching you, and when you got within range, why, then he'd maneuver. Well, in this case, your wingman would drop back, and then when that Japanese maneuvered, why, it put a very low angle on him, you see, and he'd get a head-on shot on him. So that's the way we compensated against the maneuverability factor, because we had the other two, the speed and the firepower.
The Tomahawks worked in pairs. If one of them was attacked from behind, the pilot broke outwards. If the Zero pilot followed, the second pilot pulled in behind him. Chennault used Japanese flying and staff manuals as part of the training, so that his pilots got to think like the enemy. Great emphasis was placed on gunnery. Chennault told his men, "You need to sharpen your shooting eye. Nobody ever gets too good at gunnery. The more Japs you get with your first bursts, the fewer are left to jump you." The pilots quickly developed a distinctive group personality. They were studiously casual in their dress and often went unshaven. No saluting was required, although most of them were careful to salute Chennault. When off duty in the local bars, they acquired a reputation as hellraisers. Chennault fielded 3 squadrons, each with distinctive names. The 3rd Pursuit Squadron called themselves Hell's Angels and adopted a nubile motif. The 1st adopted a leopard and called themselves Adam and Eve, after what they considered the first pursuit in history. The 2nd Squadron was known as the Panda Bears. Training neared completion as the war clouds gathered in the Far East. So far, the only fatalities suffered by Chennault's squadrons had been in flying accidents. By now, the Chinese press had given Chennault's squadrons the collective name of Flying Tigers. The distinctive insignia, a winged tiger leaping out of a Victory V, was designed with the help of artists from the Walt Disney Studio. As war approached, Chennault was still working up to strength. At the beginning of December 1941, he had only 82 pilots and 62 aircraft in commission. Battle was about to be joined. Early on the morning of the 7th of December, Japanese aircraft carriers maneuvered into position to launch their bombers and fighter escorts on a 200-mile flight to attack the base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Japanese had not declared war, and the first wave of aircraft flew in unopposed. Their approach was watched with casual interest by the American sailors below. Then the bombs began to fall. American battleships were sunk at their moorings. 300 American planes were destroyed on their airfields. Pearl Harbor was the opening blow in a Japanese drive which was to engulf the Pacific and the Far East. On the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan.
That the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Although he was eager to move the AVG into Yunnan, the better to protect the Burma Road, Chennault was at first ordered to remain at Toungoo and cooperate with the RAF against the Japanese. On the 15th of December, he received further orders to maintain one squadron at Mingladon, near Rangoon, and move the other two to Kunming, the northern terminus of the Burma Road. Thereafter, the squadrons rotated between Mingladon and Chennault's headquarters at Kunming. The Flying Tigers swung into action on the 20th of December 1941. The monsoon season was over and Japanese bombers were once more flying against Kunming. The red flare went up and 16 Tomahawks of the Adam and Eves were the first to scramble. They roared down the runway before starting a climb to 15,000 feet, their windshields frosting in the intense cold. The Japanese bombers came on. They were not anticipating opposition. But they were attacked out of the sun by the Panda Bears and then the waiting Adam and Eves. To one of the Flying Tigers, the combat seemed like a bunch of swarming bees. I wondered why our planes did not collide with each other. They looked so close. The Tigers downed 4 of the Japanese aircraft for the loss of 1 Tomahawk, which crashed on landing. The AVG's first kills were a tiny statistic in the air war, but the story was soon splashed in Time magazine under the headline of Blood for the Tigers. Although Chennault was critical of the tactics his pilots had used, the Tigers' combat debut had proved the soundness of his methods. 3 days later, the Hells Angels had their baptism of fire. They were scrambled to intercept over 50 Japanese bombers and their escorts raiding Rangoon from their bases in Thailand. They intercepted the raiders at 10,000 feet, claiming 6 bombers and 4 fighter escorts shot down, but failed to prevent the bombing of Rangoon. It was the Hells Angels' introduction to the sensations of air fighting, the dry throat, pounding heart, and the overwhelming urge to urinate as battle was about to be joined. In their combat debut, the Tigers had been joined by RAF Brewster Buffaloes, an obsolete type originally designed as a carrier fighter. But as Hells Angel RT Tadpole Smith discovered, the moment the enemy is engaged, air fighting becomes a lonely business. Later, he recalled his first combat. And now it was my turn, diving and turning to line up my gun sight, squeezing the stick trigger and hearing the crackling sound of my 4.30 caliber wing guns and the slower, powerful thuddings of the 2.50s in the nose, the pungent smell of cordite in the cockpit. 2 days later, on Christmas Day, Tadpole Smith's fellow Hells Angel, Robert Duke Hedman, was credited with shooting down 5 Japanese aircraft in a single encounter. As Chennault had warned his pilots, the odds would always be against the Tigers, in this case 7 aircraft against 35. Hedman had pursued his quarry over the Gulf of Siam and landed with only 5 gallons of fuel in the tank of his bullet-riddled Tomahawk. He missed out on becoming an ace, having insisted that all members of his flight share the credit for any plane shot down. Over Christmas, there was a bitter battle for air superiority over Rangoon. When sheer weight of numbers failed to sweep the Flying Tigers from the sky, the Japanese attempted to lure them up with nuisance raids, while large formations of fighters lurked high up in the sun. While fires raged in Rangoon, Japanese bombers showered leaflets on the city, warning its inhabitants that an airborne invasion was imminent. Japanese bombers were now raiding Minglodon. Enemy fighters slashed across the airfield, shooting up everything in their sights. But the Flying Tigers held on, with orders to protect the seaward end of the Burma Road. The ground crews built dummy tomahawks, stuffed with combustible rice straw, to draw Japanese attention from the real aircraft dispersed on the fringes of the jungle. Crashed tomahawks and the wrecked enemy warplanes which littered the rice fields around Rangoon were scavenged for spare parts. The Tigers' success over Rangoon had forced the Japanese to abandon daylight raids for night bombing. But tactical success had been achieved against a backdrop of strategic disaster. The Japanese were racing down the Malayan Peninsula to the harbour fortress of Singapore. Their British opponents remained tied to the peninsula's main roads, while the Japanese outflanked them through the jungle. As they leapfrogged towards Singapore, the Japanese bypassed and then cut off large bodies of British troops. British command was by turns timid and inept. One withdrawal was followed by another. The British streamed back to Singapore, laying charges at river crossings as they went. In Singapore itself, the evacuation of the civilian population was well underway. The fabric of the British Empire in the Far East was being torn apart. British resistance came to an end on the 15th of February, 1942. The fall of Singapore was the greatest disaster in British military history. General Yamashita accepted the surrender of the British commander, Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Percival. British humiliation was complete. Meanwhile, the Tigers were fighting against the odds in Burma, which had been invaded by the Japanese on the 12th of January. The Hells Angels had been relieved by the Panda Bears, who launched a series of strafing attacks on enemy airfields in Thailand. On the 4th of January, a flight of Tomahawks were bounced by Japanese fighters and were ensnared in just the kind of turning dogfight which Chennault had drilled them to avoid. 3 aircraft and 1 pilot were lost. The Japanese grip on Lower Burma was tightening. Japanese bombers were aloft every day. Fighting to hold on in Burma were the British General Alexander and the American General Stilwell, the commander of Chinese forces in the theater. Minglodon airfield was now under threat. As was Rangoon itself. The exodus continued. Rangoon was becoming a ghost town, its utilities knocked out, its ruined streets littered with corpses. The ancient gods waited for the conquering Japanese. It was only a matter of time before Rangoon fell. Rangoon was abandoned on the 6th of March. A flood tide of refugees headed westward, and a beaten army. The final evacuation of Rangoon had been free from air attack, a tribute to the tenacity of the Tigers. On the 25th of February alone, they had accounted for 26 enemy aircraft. The retreat continued all the way to the gates of India. The sky was black with the fires of burning oil stores. The columns of refugees stretched for miles. There was no help for those who fell by the wayside. As the Allies withdrew, the Tigers became refugees too, moving from airfield to escape the Japanese advance. With the arrival of Stilwell in the theatre, Chennault opened hostilities on a second front. Vinegar Joe had a personality every bit as prickly as Chennault's. An infantryman through and through, Stilwell engaged in a long-running and bitter dispute with Chennault over the relative priorities given to ground and air operations. Stilwell and the commander of the Flying Tigers did not see eye to eye. After the fall of Rangoon, Chennault safeguarded his dwindling resources, avoiding pitched battles and concentrating on ground attack missions on Japanese airstrips. The AA fire was often ferocious. One Tiger recalled, "I went through it 6 times. I thought every Japanese in Thailand was shooting Roman candles at me. It didn't seem possible that they could miss. Air battles were a relief after strafing." The Tigers could not prevent a rout in Burma. The longest retreat in Britain's military history continued until May. The British sustained 30,000 casualties, although many of these were Burmese troops who gave up and went home. Stilwell was left to contemplate the long road back. The Tigers fought on from a base at Loy Wing, within China. On a strafing mission on the 23rd of March, 6 Tomahawks destroyed at least 40 Japanese fighters on the ground at Chiang Mai in Thailand. Another target was the Salween Bridge, crossing a plunging gorge at the beginning of the Burma Road. The Tigers flew in to strafe and bomb Japanese columns crossing the last natural obstacle between Burma and China. Chennault reported, "I believe these attacks convinced the Japanese that a mechanized column could not operate along the Burma Road when opposed by a determined air force." But the Tigers could not save the Burma Road. Now supplies to China would have to take an even more hazardous route. It was known as the Hump, a flight by transport aircraft from Dinjan in Assam over the Himalayas to Kunming. The US 10th Air Force established a base in Assam and prepared to launch one of the most spectacular airlifts of the war. Large vehicles and items of weaponry had to be disassembled before they were loaded onto the Air Force's Curtiss, Commando and Douglas Skytrain transports. The transports left Assam to cross 530 miles of the most hazardous terrain in the world. The mountains below them rose to 20,000 feet, but they were not the only obstacle. Japanese fighters patrolled from northern Burma, so the route had to dogleg away from them, over southeastern Tibet into western Yunnan, before landing at Kunming. By the autumn of 1944, 35,000 tons a month were flown over the hump. At the beginning of July 1942, the Flying Tigers were formally inducted into the United States Army Air Force. Chennault had resisted this, fearing that the Tigers' identity and flexibility would be buried under a mountain of red tape. But it was inevitable that the Tigers would be absorbed by the growing might of the American war machine. Chennault put a brave face on it.
I've heard a lot about the Jap fighting men. They're no pushovers, that's a cinch. They're tough and they're professional. Most of them from the age of 12 or 13 have been trained to fight and to kill. We're just beginning to hit our stride. Now we're carrying the war to them. We'll kick them out of the territory they've grabbed. We'll bomb their towns to toothpicks. We'll sink their ships and knock their planes out of the air until zero is just another word for nothing. We have an answer to make to the Japs, not only because they attacked us, but for special things. Pearl Harbor, Bataan, Corregidor, Hong Kong, Java, for the murder of the American pilots who were captured after Tokyo raid. And we're going to ask the Japs so that they won't be asking for it again.
Like his men, Chennault had been recalled to active duty with the rank of Brigadier General and placed in command of the China Air Task Force. It was the AVG in all but name, but it was to grow into the 14th Air Force, functioning independently under Chennault, who was promoted to Major General. The war in the air was now turning America's way. In May 1942, the defenders of the island of Midway and the aircraft carriers of the U.S. Pacific Fleet dealt the Japanese Imperial Navy a blow from which it never recovered. It marked the beginning of the Pacific Fightback, which would carry the U.S. Marine Corps and Army across the island chains of the Pacific to Japan itself. It was amphibious and air war on a massive scale, which only the United States could afford. In the Burma Theatre, where the Flying Tigers had fired some of the first shots, the Japanese surrender came in August 1945. The wheel had turned full circle. In those hectic opening months of the war, the Flying Tigers had held the Japanese at bay at a remarkably low cost. 4 men taken prisoner and 22 killed. 4 in combat, 5 in strafing raids, 3 by enemy bombs, and 10 in crashes. They had officially destroyed 297 enemy aircraft. Understandably, perhaps, their feats grew larger over the years with every retelling. But the Tigers had been there, a mixed bunch of adventurers, romantics and hard-nosed warriors who had watched the British Empire fall and American power totter. A reporter once asked Tadpole Smith if he had ever regretted joining the Flying Tigers. With tongue in cheek, Tadpole replied, "Only when I was being shot at." They were fallible and often frightened men flying obsolescent aircraft, but they wrote a unique page in aviation history. Their commander, Claire Chennault, was stubborn and taciturn, but a natural leader. Across the bottom of his record of discharge from the Chinese Air Force, Madame Chiang Kai-shek wrote, "He performed the impossible." He and his men were truly Flying Tigers.